and a research professor at the Center for the Study of Mind in Nature, University of Oslo. She was trained in philosophy at Oxford and linguistics at MIT, where she wrote her PhD under the supervision of Noam Chomsky. Professor Wilson is a fellow of the British Academy. She has been a lecturer in philosophy at Somerville College, Oxford, Harkness Fellow in linguistics and philosophy at MIT, visiting research professor at the École Polytechnique in Paris, and I can continue, so I don't necessarily want to kind of list all of her very important positions. Her main research interest is in theoretical pragmatics. Her first book, Presuppositions and Non-Truth Conditional Semantics, was published in 1975 by Academic Press. That book advocated a pragmatic approach to presuppositions, and her long-standing collaboration with Dan Sperber has led to publications on a wide variety of pragmatic topics, from disambiguation and reference resolution to rhetoric and style. The relevance theory is basically tied to Professor Wilson's name. She is currently director with Herman Kappelan of the Linguistic Agency Project at the Center for the Study of Mind in Nature, University of Oslo, and has recently completed with Robin Carson a project titled A Unified Theory of Lexical Pragmatics, which was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council of Great Britain. Perhaps not everybody knows here that Professor Wilson is a fiction writer as well. Her novel Slave of Passions was published in 1991 by Picador and was shortlisted for 2 awards. And as far as I know, she's working on a second book. I don't know when she's going to complete that.
Very slowly.
Very slowly. On a personal matter, I had the privilege to meet Professor Wilson first when we taught in the same graduate summer school at the University of Granada. And we visited each other's classes, and I enjoyed her logical approach to the subject matter and her rigorous analysis. We are very fortunate to have Professor Wilson here as a keynote speaker today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Wilson.
See, if I talk here, no one can see me. So I'm going to try talking here. Can you hear me all right at the back? That's okay? I can't do much about the content, but at least you should hear what I say. I wanted to thank Istvan Keçkes very much for that introduction. And on behalf of all the participants, I would like to thank the 2 organizers, Jesus Romero Trio and Istvan, and also the local organizing committee, who have worked so hard in the last few months, and particularly the last few weeks, to make this conference such a happy and exciting prospect. I know we're all looking forward to it very much, and I'd like to thank them in advance for all the work they've done. I'd also like to say that on a personal note, I'm very pleased to see so many old friends here, and I'm looking forward to renewing acquaintance with many people and to meeting new people too. I don't have an overhead, so it's important that you have access to a handout. If anyone hasn't got a handout, could you put your hand up and someone will try and get you one? And there's one spare here. So keep your hand up if you still need a handout. There are a few at the back. And if you haven't got one, if you could possibly share with people next to you, that would be good. So I'm planning to talk for 50 minutes, and I will simply stop at 10:02 so that there is time for questions. I will try and finish, but who knows? Depends how excited I get in the course of it. I'll try not to get excited, and you try not to get excited too. So my talk is on understanding and believing. This is a slightly new project over the last few years, and I would like to acknowledge my co-workers on the project, Dan Sperber, François Clément, Christophe Heinz, Olivier Mascaro, Hugo Mercier, and Gloria Origi. There's a paper by all of us that came out in Mind and Language last month, and I'm going to talk mainly about that and about its implications. I'm not quite sure what to do about the people who've just come in and haven't got handouts. Yeah, if you haven't got a handout, please go and sit next to someone who has, because there's no way you'll understand otherwise. Okay, so here's some background. The relation between understanding and believing has been debated very vigorously in philosophy of language and to some extent in psychology, but it hasn't been much discussed in pragmatics. And I think that's a shame. So the goals of this talk, as I've put on the handout in one, are to set out some of the issues involved in these debates on understanding versus believing, mainly in the philosophical and psychological literature. And second, 1B, to show that pragmatics can both contribute to these debates and benefit from them. It's easy to see, I think, how pragmatics can contribute to these debates. It's harder to see how it can benefit from them, but that's really what interests me, and I'll be talking about that towards the end. So in the main first section of my talk, then, I'm going to talk about the relation between understanding and believing as it's been discussed in philosophy of language and psychology. And to the question, what's the relation between understanding and believing, you find two main answers, which I've called answer A and answer B. Answer A is assertions, utterances presented as true, are believed by default. We don't first understand them and then assess their credibility. We start by believing and doubt them only in special circumstances, so there's default acceptance. And I've put on the handout two quotes from philosophers of language. Ruth Millikan, who says, "Speech is a form of direct perception of whatever speech is about. Interpreting speech does not require making any inference or having any beliefs about speakers' intentions." That's a direct challenge to pragmatics, or to Gricean pragmatics anyway. It's actually normally then limited just to the explicit content of utterances. They say, well, Grice can do what he likes with implicatures, but as regards explicit content, there's no inferential intention recognition. You just believe what is said, and that's it. Similarly, Tyler Burge, who's a very famous defender of this view, says, has something that he calls an acceptance principle. And he says, a person is entitled to accept as true something that is presented as true and that is intelligible to him, unless there are stronger reasons not to do so. And then what looks like an empirical claim, as children and often as adults, we lack reasons not to accept what we are told. These ideas have also been taken up in psychology, and it looks as if there's some evidence for them. The person who's mainly associated with this view is Daniel Gilbert. And by the way, all these people trace their descent from various philosophers. Daniel Gilbert says his descent is from Spinoza. Reid is also another philosopher who's credited with this sort of view. So here's a couple of quotes from Daniel Gilbert. The comprehension and acceptance of ideas are not clearly separable psychological acts, but rather comprehension includes acceptance of that which is comprehended. And acceptance and rejection are not merely alternative outcomes of a single assessment process, but rather acceptance is psychologically prior. As I said, they're mainly only thinking about explicit communication, but the implication for pragmatics of this view then is that explicit communication is what they call content preserving. The content in the speaker's mind is preserved and communicated to the hearer. It does not involve inferential intention recognition of a Gricean sort, and temporary acceptance at least is part of understanding, though in special circumstances you can reconsider. And the evidence that Gilbert has found for this is based on experiments of which I'll give you a typical example. So it's with computer screens, and participants get sentences which are supposed to contain either possible words of Hopi or words that are not words of Hopi, followed by an indication true, indicating that this is a word of Hopi, or false, indicating that it's not a word of Hopi. And they're told that they will be later tested on whether they can remember which words were presented as genuine words of Hopi. So they get on the computer screen things like 2A, a monishna is a star, true. Or 2B, a tika is a fox, false. And his hypothesis was this: if acceptance is part of understanding, and if you distract participants while they're processing the signal false after an utterance, they'll tend to remember it as true. So what they did was they showed the indication false, but they asked participants to recognize a tone or do something else while they were processing the indication false. And indeed, the prediction was confirmed. Participants who were distracted while processing the indication false tended to remember the word as a genuine word of Hopi. They tended to take the utterance as true. So the idea is you just by default, you understand utterances as true. Okay, the second answer, answer B, which to me, and I hope to most people here, is the common sense answer. I don't know, but it's certainly the answer that I'm going to defend, is this. Understanding and believing are distinct psychological processes, and epistemic vigilance, that's to say, processes geared to assessing the trustworthiness or the credibility of communicated information, are always at work. It's not that you start by believing and then reconsider. You start by understanding and decide whether or not to believe. This is the standard view in philosophy of language and pragmatics in the tradition of Austin, Grice, and Strawson. If you look at Austin's work on uptake, which was understanding, that was distinct from perlocutionary effects, which were to do with believing. And I'll come back to Grice and Strawson's stuff on meaning later if I have time. But a classic example of this is the relevance theory, Sperber and Wilson's definition of ostensive communication given in our book Relevance. And here's what they said goes on in ostensive communication. The communicator produces an utterance intended thereby, simplified version, 3A, informative intention to inform the audience of something, and 3B, communicative intention to inform the audience of the informative intention. Now, if you can work your way through the content of the informative intention and the communicative intention, the idea is this. 3A, the informative intention, is about intending the audience to believe. 3B is about intending the audience to recognize this intention. And so understanding involves recognizing what the speaker intends you to believe. There's a clear distinction between understanding and believing, but they're related. And on epistemic, by the way, can people at the back still hear? All right? Yeah. On epistemic vigilance, this is the assessment rather than the understanding bit. Here's a quote from Sperber et al., 2010. In communication, it's not that we can generally be trustful and therefore need to be vigilant only in rare and special circumstances. We could not be mutually trustful unless we were mutually vigilant. So the implication of that answer for pragmatics is that explicit communication may involve just as much inferential intention recognition as implicit communication, and acceptance may not be the default. And there are two lines of evidence for this. First, there is the history of work in pragmatics over the last 20 years on pragmatics and explicit communication. And there seems to be increasing evidence that inferential pragmatic processes, for example, saturation, free enrichment, lexical modulation, contribute to explicit content. And I've given references to Anne Beisenhout, 1998, who uses this argument against Tyler Burge, the pragmatic argument against Tyler Burge. Origi and Sperber, 2000, who used the same line of pragmatic argument against Ruth Millikan. And of course, classic works on inferential pragmatics like Robin Carsten and François Recanati. And the idea of this approach is that the goal of pragmatics is to recognize speakers' intentions at both the explicit and the implicit level. So there's no such thing as default acceptance.